Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about a reformed hacker's secrets and why zero trust segmentation is my worst nightmare as a reformed child hacker. My name's Paul Dant. Joining me as well today is Christopher Swartz, our Director of Industry Solutions. Let's go ahead and dive in. So a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about. I'll be speaking from the attacker perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey growing up as a hacker. We're going to talk about something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework to add some context and depth to our understanding of attacks. And then we're going to be talking about two key techniques that I find to be critical in virtually any successful cyber attack. And that's lateral movement and something that we call living off the land. Then we're going to jump over to Krister, and he's going to speak to us from the defender perspective. For the most part, talking about how zero trust segmentation is what we need to stop hackers, like the hacker that I was in previous days. And then he's going to talk about Illumio's zero trust segmentation platform and exactly how it does that. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up hacking. I got into computers and video games really early, the late 80s. I was probably around 7 or 8 years old. This is me sitting in front of my first computer, a Tandy 1000EX. And it was right around this time that I actually published my first computer game called Gulliver's Travels. I published it under the shareware model where you had to pay me money to play the full game rather than just a short demo. And long story short, my game was hacked. I had never heard of that before. I had never thought of it. I didn't really even know what that meant. But as a young kid, so taken by these computer games, by the industry, by the technology, that was a mind-expanding experience for me and really got me started into looking at how copy protection mechanisms and other aspects of software work, most importantly, how to bypass them. So I retired very quickly from video game development and got into software piracy as a hobby. And what I want to talk to you about today is how that hobby sort of developed into a full-blown career as a hacker, sometimes as what we call black hat hacker, later in life, of course, as a so-called white hat hacker, where I'm carrying these attacks out with permission from the target organization, some awareness of what I'm doing in order to assess their overall security posture, something that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with today. So I want to tell you about a couple of the attacks that I carried out. The very first malicious attack I carried out, I was actually in 7th grade. I was around 12 years old. My target was a simulated space shuttle mission. This was actually a school science project. It was very cool, but my objective was to disrupt this simulated shuttle mission. What happened? I was able to carry out a distributed denial of service attack and ultimately hold 47 IBM PS2s hostage. Keep in mind, this is the early 90s. And I did that simply by looping a network message. Mission was disrupted. Now, how I did it, there were aspects of social engineering involved, of course, convincing, tricking people to do things on their computers that I want them to do. And then there was also lateral movement, which you're going to hear me talk about quite a bit today. The idea that from my position on a particular network, I can look around and identify operational aspects of this shuttle mission. What are the computers that are most important operating it? And then target them. Carrying out the attack, I use something that we call living off the land tactics. And if you're not familiar with that, you're going to hear about that a lot today as well. But ultimately, living off the land is simply using what is available to me, typically within the operating system of the system that I'm targeting as an attack, or the operating system of the system that I'm sitting on at that particular time in the network. In this particular case, I used an MS-DOS batch file to provide essentially an infinite loop. And within that loop, I used a Novell network command line to send a network message. So if you think about that, I'm sending a message to a set of systems in an infinite loop, distributed denial of service. What made this attack possible for me, of course, the ability to move laterally throughout the network and those living off the land techniques that we're going to be talking about pretty consistently today. So let's talk about another attack. This was much more recent, later in life, but the target is a pre-release tentpole film set. So the primary objective for this particular attack, stealing intellectual property in the form of pre-release film content. So what happened in this attack? I was able to gain access to live camera feed in real time on my personal cell phone. So IP stolen for sure. How did I do it? This will look very familiar based on the attack that I just spoke about against the simulated shuttle mission. Social engineering played a role, but most importantly, lateral movement, being able to gain access to the network that all of these systems were sitting on, move around that network to identify critical pieces. In this case, where's the camera feed? And then, of course, using living off the land tactics, what's available to me. The Apple App Store actually provided on my cell phone both a tool to scan that network, as well as a client that could actually access those camera feed systems. And all of this, of course, is taking place over a wireless network. So all of that is there, provided for me to carry out the attack. So what I ultimately came to the conclusion of is that you are letting me in when I carry these attacks out. And that's really where zero trust comes into play. Two key things that I pull from zero trust. The first is the need for least privileged access. Most of us are pretty aware of that as a traditional part of how we approach security. But keep in mind that least privileged access doesn't just involve identity. Network access is a big part of that as well. The other piece, though, that is, I think, a bigger shift for us today is the idea of assuming compromise, that every network infiltration will not necessarily be detected and prevented. So we need to build resilience such that when that infiltration does occur, we're able to survive it. So let's shift really quickly to talk about something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a construct that is essentially a catalog of attacker behaviors. The ATT&CK stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. So if you think about this as a catalog of attacker behaviors, the knowledge that this provides is critical in being able to build the proper defenses. So let's dig in a little bit more. The framework is organized by three key constructs: tactics, techniques, and procedures. So let's dig into that. Tactics, think of these as high-level goals or objectives of the attack, almost chronological phases, if you will, of how the attack progresses. Techniques are the specific methods used by an attacker that allow us to progress in the attack. So moving from tactic to tactic, we're utilizing techniques to do that. And then lastly, procedures are a step down, even more detail of how these attacks are actually carried out and how they progress. So digging into tactics for a second, we can see starting with reconnaissance all the way down to the last item here, impact. This is essentially the chronological order of an attack. If you think of a ransomware attack, reconnaissance allows us to identify a valuable or a valid target, rather, identify valuable systems, valuable data, all the way down to the impact where maybe we're carrying out a distributed denial of service attack, we're encrypting data, whatever it is that we're choosing to use as essentially an extortion technique. But as we've kind of alluded to, as I've talked about some of the attacks that I've carried out in the past, these first three, reconnaissance, resource development, most importantly, initial access, this really is it. Once that attacker has gained access to your network, in many cases, it's game over. If it's undetected, which it most likely will be, there are a lot of ways to gain that initial foothold. Some include exploits, O-days, but then there are also much simpler ways to do it. Buying valid credentials, spear phishing campaigns. The idea is we need to be prepared for that initial access because it will happen at some point if it hadn't happened already. So let's dig specifically into the lateral movement tactic, something that I've been talking about quite a bit. The basic idea behind lateral movement, the adversary is trying to move through your environment. Think about that for a second. That's a pretty scary thing when we're making the assumption that all of this activity is happening sort of under our noses. It's not detected. This is the part where attackers spend a lot of their time planning things out, coordinating, identifying target assets, and then lastly, staging for that impact phase. All of that stuff happens sometimes in the span of weeks, maybe even days, as things like ChatGPT and other generative AI come into play. Attackers are able to automate things a lot faster. So the amount of time they're having to spend in the environment to carry out the attack is lessening. And that's something that we need to be concerned about. So the lateral movement threat, attackers are moving freely within your network. I mentioned that entry is sometimes via benign actions, logging in with valid credentials, say to a VPN server. That's a perfectly valid initial access point for an attacker. Compromising that single system, attackers can then identify, infiltrate other assets, probably more critical assets that are going to allow them to really push on those pressure points to try to elicit a payment. Moving from system to system can even expose attackers to entirely new networks, whether it's multi-home systems, whatever the case might be. Once the attacker is in, we can typically move around pretty freely in an undetected manner. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, living off the land. I've mentioned this a few times. I want to clarify exactly what it is and why it's so important in the context of carrying out attacks, particularly the attacks that I've carried out successfully. So if we think about the native capabilities of our operating systems, our underlying technology, virtual machines, orchestration of containers like Kubernetes, all of these capabilities empower us as users, but they also empower the attackers. The attackers can use those things against us. So really living off the land is attackers using legitimate system tools to hide their activities. And there are great examples. This is by no means an exhaustive list. You're probably familiar with at least a few of these in terms of how attackers operate, as well as how malware operates. PowerShell for downloading malicious payloads. We don't always know that those payloads that are being downloaded are malicious. Sometimes it just looks like PowerShell doing its thing. Ransomware payloads that aim to encrypt data, make it unusable, are actually using native operating system crypto APIs to achieve that objective. It's very difficult to determine if something's being encrypted. Is this legitimate or is this malicious? There's not always enough context to know. That's the value of living off the land for attackers. So in the context of everything that we've just talked about, Illumio, our aim is to prevent a breach, that initial compromise that I focused on, from becoming a cyber disaster because of the lateral movement throughout the environment, the identification of more critical, more valuable assets, and then lastly, living off the land tactics that allow attackers to achieve these objectives. That's really the aspect that we're preventing here with zero trust segmentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Krister.
Now, we need to ask ourselves a question. Is there a way for us to protect ourselves against the younger Paul the hacker? Is there a way to effectively protect my environment from a hacker breaking in and hijacking one of my workloads and preventing that one problem from spreading into a disaster? We have to assume the worst. Prevention tools are required, but they're never going to be 100%. So on the left-hand side, this circle encompasses most of the tools used to try to keep bad things out. So every data center needs a firewall or some kind of IPS or IDS system. Every cloud environment will need a SASE solution or a ZTNA solution. Every remote access solution needs some kind of multi-factor authentication. And all workloads probably need some kind of antivirus scanner. But the reality is that these are never 100%, and at some point they will break. And young Paul the hacker will find a way to get through this. The question is, what then? What happens once that inevitable breach occurs? Part of zero trust is to push the trust boundary directly out to the workload. So the trust boundary is no longer these tools in the circle. The trust boundary is your stuff, your workload. And once that breach happens, we want to be able to not trust anything. Once that one workload is infected, all of the surrounding workloads do not trust that workload, and that one breach is not able to spread laterally. If we roll the clock back about 20 years, this approach to policy, to security, has really gone through three phases. Back about 20 years ago, we were trying to keep the bad stuff out. We were trying to prevent things from happening. The problem is that most of the great breaches over the past 20 years or so have all had these solutions in place. They've had firewalls, they've had cloud perimeter security, they've had agents on workloads. But guess what? They didn't work. They all got breached anyway. So as time went forward, we tried to change our focus a bit into a detection approach. Let's do a detect and response solution. So if a workload is hijacked, we want to be able to try to understand what that payload is trying to do. And once we've understood what it is, then make a decision. The problem is that most, or if not all, modern malware, especially ransomware, is much faster than any detection tool. So by the time you've figured out what that malware is trying to do, it's too late. It has already spread, and you may now know that you're being affected by Paul the hacker or by the international mafia, but who cares? It's too late. You have been hijacked, and that solution is not effective. So we're now really in the containment era. We're now assuming breaches. No matter what you do, no matter how much money you spend, you will be breached. How do we contain that inevitable breach? And how do we do that without adding an unnecessary amount of complexity to the solution? Some quick definitions. Zero trust is largely about pushing the trust boundary out to every single resource. So every single application is its own trust boundary, not relying on network boundaries. So in a data center, a trust boundary is not a VLAN, it's not an IP subnet, it's your workload. In a cloud, a segment or or trust boundary is not a VPC or a VNet or a security group. It is the resource no matter where it lives. And so this is really microsegmentation. We're talking about segmentation everywhere, and everywhere means micro. So we want to be able to do micro segmentation at any scale, from small to medium to large. And we want to be able to use this to achieve breach containment. So any one of these workloads will be breached, we have to assume, but we want to be able to block it from going anywhere else. And zero trust means that none of these workloads really trust each other. And we want to be able to create a least privileged access model to prevent the spread of malware. So if we zoom out and look at the modern reality where people are really accessing critical resources remotely, there are three broad enforcement points. On the left-hand side, this is the end device. These are the endpoints. These are the laptops. These are the mobile devices. And this is where identity is. And most people have implemented something at this point. So this is the world of multi-factor authentication, facial recognition, fingerprinting. This is a way of enforcing that you are who you claim you are before you try to access the environment. When you open up a session, you're going to hit now, in the modern world, a SASE or a ZTNA boundary. This used to be VPNs. These are largely being replaced by these two solutions, with the cloud being the access point. And this is what's going to determine whether you're allowed in. And if it does allow you in, it's going to decide what your privileges are. So this solution may refer to an Active Directory resource, and it decides that, well, okay, you're a contractor. I'm only going to give you access to, say, 10 resources in the right-hand side. And then the third part of this is the third pillar, or the third enforcement point. And this is the east-west problem, which has been around for a long time. If the second enforcement point is the north-south boundary, this is traffic going in and out of your environment. All of the traffic laterally between resources is the east-west problem. And this has been a challenge in security for a long time, because that second enforcement point is not going to have very clear visibility into the east-west lateral propagation in the environment. And we want to avoid having to put in thousands of firewalls between all of these devices. With all of these three enforcement points, we have to assume that eventually it's going to break. Paul the hacker is going to figure out a way to hijack an endpoint. It's going to be able to look like it's legit. It's going to be able to break through that SASE or ZTNA solution, and it's going to hit some device in that destination. What we want to do is be able to assume that will happen, but not let it go anywhere. We want to be able to contain it. So as that one breach workload tries to move laterally, it's not going anywhere. And this is the solution that Illumio enables. Zero trust is a realistic architecture because Illumio is preventing the spread of malware without necessarily having to understand the intention of the malware. So there are two broad philosophies towards protecting your environment. On the left-hand side, this is the traditional approach. You stick a bunch of agents onto a workload that tries to protect the health of that workload. And if a problem occurs, we're going to try to scrub it as quickly as possible and keep that workload running. The other approach is on the right-hand side. And this is one where we basically sacrifice an infected workload. That workload has been hit by something. We don't know what it is, but we can see that it's trying to open ports and connect to workloads laterally. And generally, there's very little reason for workloads to be talking to each other. Laptops shouldn't be talking to each other. VMs shouldn't be talking to all other VMs. Cloud resources shouldn't be talking to other cloud resources. There are some exceptions, but we want to be able to assume that, broadly speaking, they should not be doing that. And we can block all of that without understanding what that workload is being affected by. We want to be able to assume that something has hit it, we're going to let it die, but we're going to stop the spread. So instead of trying to protect the health of the workload, as on the left-hand side, we're going to contain the breach and let that one workload die rather than letting all of your workloads die. So microsegmentation means that we want to be able to segment at any scale. And this is why we cannot rely on other forms of segmentation, such as network segmentation. On the left-hand side, if I have 20 workloads, I want 20 segments. Now, I could maybe get 20 VLANs in a data center, but if I have 200 workloads, I want 200 segments. I don't want to have to ask for 200 VLANs. And if I have 200,000 workloads, I want 200,000 segments without bothering the network architecture. These bigger numbers can seem a bit academic, but you can reach them quicker than you think. If you, for instance, deploy a microservices Kubernetes architecture in your environment and you want to be able to potentially segment all of the entities in that, you can reach these big numbers quicker than you think. So we want the microsegmentation to be enabled without being dependent on any other form of segmentation. So the first problem is visibility. I need to be able to see what's going on before I can make any kind of decision. So the first step is, how do I see who's doing what to who? This diagram is a real diagram that Illumio created from a financial customer with about 80 workloads. And this shows all the flows between those 80 workloads. Now, this is useful up to a point. I mean, it's a bit of a hairball, but you can hover your mouse over each of these lines and it will show you what kind of traffic is passing between each of these workloads. But now I need to segment. Where do I start? How do I segment these things, these flows in a way that makes sense? And I don't want to be forced to segment against IP addresses because IP addresses can be confusing and they're ephemeral. Too many workloads change IP addresses dynamically. So I want to be able to create some kind of segmentation along business functions. So in this diagram, each white circle is a business boundary, and they're labeled. So in the upper left, you can see in the bottom that I have labeled these ordering systems. They're in production, and they're located in the US. And then underneath that, there's a business segment that says these are ordering systems in the US, but these are development resources. Now, development resources should generally not be accessing production resources. Showing this kind of diagram immediately can reveal compliance violations. I shouldn't be seeing lines here, but I can see between those two circles on the left-hand side that they're red, which means that traffic is trying to flow between them, but they are being blocked. Illumio is managing these resources and we are preventing the flows, but we now can very quickly identify what those are and prevent them. So we quickly discover compliance violations. Now, in order to create a segmentation solution as part of our zero trust journey, what is the minimum amount of information that we need in order to do that? On the left-hand side, we can put a solution that is complex and is able to do a lot of impressive magic, a lot of deep layer 7 inspection, a lot of behavioral analytics, being able to crack open encrypted payloads, and then make a decision. Or on the right-hand side, we can collect just a very minimal amount of information to make the same decision. The goal here is to prevent propagation. Do we need the amount of information on the left-hand side in order to do that? As Paul showed, in order to get malware to move, it's going to look for an open port. And all modern OSs have ports open by default. So every Windows workload, for example, has these two ports open. And if Paul's malware hijacks workload number 1, it's going to sniff for open ports. And let's say it finds an open RDP port, it's going to spoof that, which is easy, hijack the second workload, it's going to spoof for an open port, and it's going to hijack that workload. This will happen very, very quickly. And this will be the same whether that malware is sophisticated malware or if it's simple malware. They share one thing in common. They like to move. They like to propagate. And that's what we need to focus on in order to prevent propagation. So in this example, I have 2 clouds and I have workloads that really shouldn't be talking to each other. There's very little reason for workloads to be RDPing to each other or SMBing to each other. And if I can block those ports between these workloads, these red lines represent workloads trying to spread. Paul's malware is trying to move, but it's not going anywhere. These red lines means that we are blocking those ports. So that first workload has no way of spreading to any other workloads. And we can make some exceptions. We might want to RDP centrally from a couple of jump hosts, but that's going to be somewhere at the bottom of this diagram. These ports should not be used laterally to the left or the right side of this diagram. Now, segmentation comes in different flavors. So people might agree that, okay, segmentation is important, but that one question, give me a segment, is going to come in different answers depending on what environment you're in. So if you're in a data center or in a cloud or dealing with mobility, you're going to get different kinds of segments. So if you ask a data center team for segments, they'll say, okay, I have network-centric answers. So I have firewalls. Firewalls have zones. How many zones do you need? Hypervisors move network boundaries up into the host, and it will try to give you boundaries there. SDN means that we're going to create overlay tunnel topologies, so like VXLAN or Geneve. But these are not going to be delivered one segment per workload. Network segments are designed to solve network problems, like preventing DDoS or ARP spoofing or dealing with routing. They were not designed to create one segment per workload. If I go to a cloud environment, I'm going to get network answers again. If I want segments, they're just going to be virtualized. So a VPC is a virtual network segment. A security group is similar to an access list on a hardware switch. And they're going to have virtual firewalls, and they're going to have virtual load balancers and virtual IDS systems. I'm still relying on the underlying fabric to segment. And this is what I want to avoid. Zero trust means my applications are what I need to segment, not anything else. Mobility, if I want segments there, I'm going to get traditionally VPNs as a segment. Or these days I might get a SASE or a ZTNA solution as a segment. Or people might put antivirus agents on my workload and call those segments. But these are silos. I don't want to create different kinds of segments in each of these environments because it just gets complicated. And what often happens is that what people will do is on top of all this, deploy some kind of behavioral analytics tool, maybe a SIM system like Splunk, and it'll vacuum up the logs from all these environments and try to make sense of all the traffic. And you're going to end up with a complex solution, which is hard to deal with when you're trying to correlate a breach. As Paul mentioned, there's a simpler way to do this. All malware is going to try to spread. So instead of trying to introduce all this complexity, let's just close the doors. Let's just prevent whatever is hitting it from spreading and leave it at that. Now, once that propagation has been closed, if there's no way for a hijacked workload to move, at that point, now you can use those behavioral analytics tools, layer 7 intelligence to figure out what the malware was trying to do to you. But it makes more sense to do that after the fact rather than during the breach, because it wastes time. The more time these tools use to try to understand what's going on, the more time that malware has to spread. And this is what we want to avoid. And we want this to work whether I'm in a data center or in a cloud. So in the left-hand side, this shows a data center with a couple of common SDN overlay segments that we don't want to rely on, because if I want to move one of these workloads to the cloud on the right side, those generally are not going to be there. I want to be able to carry my segmentation solution with me. So if I take one of these VMs and I want to be able to move that out to a cloud environment, I don't want the segmentation to break. I want to be able to carry my solution with me. So segmentation at the workload is totally decoupled from segmentation in these fabrics. Those segments need to be there, but they're there to solve different problems. We want to be able to do this without adding yet one more tool to the many that you already have. We want to automate what you already have. And one of those is the fact that all modern OSs have built-in port filtering, basic layer 3, layer 4 firewalling. We want to be able to automate that centrally. So on the right-hand side of this at the bottom, Windows Firewall, all modern Windows workloads have Windows filtering platform. All Linux workloads have either IP tables or NF tables. Oracle and IBM have their versions, containers, relies on IP tables. We want to be able to write policies centrally and have that policy be pushed out into whatever makes sense to each of these OSs. So if I write one policy that says no RDP anywhere, no SMB anywhere, I want to be able to push that out everywhere, then write some exceptions later and have that be pushed out everywhere. But I want to be able to define this and model this centrally. So Illumio's approach is we're going to harvest telemetry from all managed workloads, whether it's public cloud, data center, or mobility, mobile users. We want to be able to understand what's going on, collect this centrally, and then label it. And metadata means using some kind of human readable string to label these workloads using multi-dimensional labels. So we want to say that you're a web server, you're used by ERP, you're in production, business unit is IT, the location's in Boston, and you're a Windows workload. We want to be able to get as granular as possible, but in none of these terms am I referring to a network address. I don't care where this stuff is. Workloads might even move between them. But if I can write policy using a human readable constructs, this makes it much easier to understand what's going on in my network, either during or without a breach. So labeling is the ability to take a workload and identify it using something other than its network addressing. So in this example, there are two ways to do this. On the left-hand side is the traditional three-tiered architecture. So this is what you'd see in a data center. In a data center, they might create 3 VLANs, and each VLAN will be devoted to each tier. This is assuming the old world where workloads basically stayed put. The modern reality is that workloads like to move. VMs like to live migrate, containers workloads die and come back to life. You can't assume that an IP address or a VLAN is a useful way to identify workloads. So the orange icons mean that Illumio is enabling a labeled approach to this. So on the right-hand side here are 4 example labels for workloads. And if we can move the identification away from the left side of this diagram and into the right side of this diagram, this means that I can now visualize what's going on based on these 4 labels, and then make segmentation decisions based on the same labels. And on the left-hand side, I have now freed up those tiers to do network things. So in between these tiers, there are switches. Switches have access lists. This frees them up to focus on network issues and not workload issues. So again, I want to be able to end up with this kind of a diagram. I want to be able to look at this and see what my labeled workloads are doing without first having to know what the IP addresses are, without having to first understand, is it a data center or a cloud environment? I just want to see who's doing what to who, and then drill down from there as needed. I want to be able to use a declarative model. I want to avoid the traditional problem that firewalls have had ever since the beginning, and that's rule order. On a traditional firewall, if I want to create a new rule, I've decided, or I've discovered what Paul the hacker is trying to do. I want to add that rule to my firewall, but where do I put it? If I put it in the wrong order, I can break things. If I put that new rule too high, I may break some dependency lower down in the rule set. If I put the new rule too low, I might never hit it because something else will get hit first. So we want to be able to define the end state. And this is similar to an Alexa box. When I say, hey, Alexa, play music, I may not understand how it's doing it. I just want to define the end state. I want you to play music. I'm giving you the what and not the how. So Illumio enables a similar approach. When you define a new rule, you can say, look, I want to block these ports against these labeled workloads in these locations. Illumio will decide where to put those rules. You do not have to worry about the rule order. Illumio enables a declarative model where you define the what, and Illumio defines the how, which means that, again, we can return back to the same picture, that we are now blocking certain ports laterally everywhere, making exceptions later, but this immediately blocks the propagation paths that almost all malware uses today. And this enables us to close or enforce the 3 enforcement points that's part of zero trust. So using remote access models as an example in the bottom left, identity is enabled by, say, multi-factor authentication tools. The prevention into the environment is enabled by a SASE or a ZTNA solution into a cloud, or maybe a data center firewall. And that third point, the microsegmentation, is the breach containment, which is what Illumio enables. So this means that the full zero trust segmented model is enabled. So if the next young Paul the hacker tries to break through this, it's going to have 3 enforcement points that will block that malware from propagating across your environment. So the benefits of this approach, the zero trust solution that Illumio enables, is that we can block 100% of malware without understanding 100% of malware. So nobody can claim to understand 100% of what hackers are trying to do, but we can narrow it down to how they move. They all like to move, and they're only going to move by a certain limited number of ways through open ports. And that's what we can control. We are following a declarative model. So like you can say, hey, Alexa, play music. I'm saying, hey, Illumio, block RDP, block SMB. The customer defines the what, Illumio defines the how. We are quickly blocking lateral communication and also command and control without necessarily understanding what that communication is. We're just blocking the propagation at all. An important point is being able to simulate this before deploying. So you can define policy that looks right, but if you push it out, you're going to be following the deploy and pray model. I deploy it and I pray that phone doesn't ring. We want to instead be able to define a policy and then put it into essentially a monitoring mode where you will see what would happen should that policy be pushed out. And you can then modify it as needed until it finally looks right, and then you can deploy it. So Illumio enables a stepped approach where you can create policy, you can simulate policy, and then finally you can deploy policy. And this significantly reduces the risk of breaking something. And the goal is we want you to sleep well at night, knowing that you will not be in the news the next morning. You do not want to wake up that next morning and look in the news and see that your enterprise is the latest victim of ransomware. This keeps you out of the news, it keeps you safe, and it gives you a high level of confidence that even if one workload is breached, production is not impacted. That one workload is not going to bring down the entire environment. With this being the end goal, the prevention tools are still going to be needed. This does not replace them. This completes them. So it completes the zero trust architecture by allowing the prevention tools to do what they do, but then Illumio contains the inevitable breach, ensuring you that that zero trust model is implemented using a highly scalable and simplified version of microsegmentation. Now we can pass this back off to some Q&A to answer some questions that people might have.
All right, thank you, everyone. That is a wrap for our content, but we do have time for a few questions. Krista and I are both going to be answering those based on what the audience has submitted. So the first question that we have, why is lateral movement such an issue? And before I drop it over to Krista, I'm going to take a stab at this as well. As we talked about, lateral movement is an issue because it's really core to all types of cyber attacks. We focus a lot on ransomware, what it is that allows for these ransomware attacks to be successful and be so devastating. Lateral movement really is the core to that. And what we really talk about with lateral movement is an attacker's ability to move around a network, maybe moving into other networks, silently, undetected, in order to identify the most critical assets that can be used as pressure points against that target organization. Krister, what do you think?
Yeah, I point out to people that the majority of cybersecurity these days is focused on keeping your workload healthy and working. And if something bad happens, it's going to try to detect the problem, it's going to try to scrub it and keep it, keep it functional. The problem is, by the time you do that, that's already spread. No matter how fast you are, the problem is that it's spread like wildfire. And that malware is not so much concerned with resources on your machine. It might just simply want to take down the entire infrastructure and hold you hostage. So this is why we sort of almost need to pay less attention to the intention of the criminal. Like, do I need to know why someone's breaking into my house before I lock the doors? Lateral movement is, like you said, common to all malware, whether it's done by the international mafia or by my teenage son. No matter how simple done, it's good looking for open ports and it's going to spread. And by the time you fix that one workload, you're now looking at paying a huge ransom. So that lateral movement is the goal of the criminal, without having to know anything else. You don't have to understand how complex the solution is. Just keep it isolated. That first workload, sacrifice it, let it die. Don't worry about trying to fix it, let it die.
Absolutely. Yes. And as I spoke about earlier, a lot of the attacks that I carried out previously as a child hacker would have been thwarted, stopped in their tracks, had we had something like Illumio's zero trust segmentation solution in place back then. Thank you, Krister. So our next question, can I already do zero trust with the tools I have? I'll take a first stab at this as well and say largely no. And the challenge there, as we've talked about during this webinar, is we can't secure things. We can't achieve zero trust, without being able to actually see what is in the environment and see where the risk is truly concentrated. So examples that we gave throughout the webinar today, RDP, SMB, SSH, along with a number of other services, we don't really have a good way today. We haven't really, for decades now, had a good way to identify what is in our environment, what is talking into our environment, how our systems in the environment talking outwards. Without that type of visibility, we just simply can't secure and achieve what zero trust tells us we need to achieve. Krister, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the problem is the term zero trust has been around long enough now that each vendor means something different by it. And lately,
Yes.
a lot of the industry has sort of coalesced around the idea of identity. So they'll talk about remote access. I enter the cloud environment, that SASE or ZTNA solution, figures out who I am, gives me certain permissions, and I'll call that zero trust. The problem is, if I can break through that and I'm in the environment, I can now spread from workload to workload to workload. Zero trust needs to mean that we push the trust boundary out directly to the resources that we're accessing. I mean, you want to pay attention to my identity, obviously, but the word zero trust has been redefined to the detriment of the zero trust architecture. It's not identity. It is making sure that there's a least privilege access between all resources. So assume that identity can be breached. Once I get into that workload, zero trust means I can't go to the next workload. So this is what zero trust means. That means you have to do it at the workload and not at the remote access point, not at the network layer. You need to do it directly at the workload. And that's what Illumio enables.
Absolutely. Yes. And as we spoke about before, we've highlighted lateral movement, and that's really one of the things that zero trust segmentation in particular is addressing, is that lateral movement and limiting the ability for the attacker to be successful in whatever their attack objectives are. Disruption of operations, a ransom payment from the target organization. Those are the things that we're really trying to prevent. And of course, as zero trust tells us, we need to assume compromise and plan for that. When we know that we're going to have an attacker infiltrate, are we ready? Do we have resilience? Can we stand by basically our standard operational aspects and not have that attacker achieve the objectives set out by infiltrating into the environment? Awesome. Krister, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. I hope you found this very interesting. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us.